federal government released its emissions reduction plan today in Vancouver. And I'm going to be talking to Mark Winfield, who is professor of environmental studies at York University, about the electricity section of that plan. So welcome to the interview, Mark.
Good afternoon, Markham.
Now, there have been plenty of releases before of different plans and strategies by the federal government. And I think what struck me about this one for the electricity plan is that it's thin gruel as a standalone. There's not much new here, not much new leadership. And what's your take on this?
Well, that would be my take as well. Indeed, I'm wondering if, in fact, there's a bit of backpedaling going on here, even given that I couldn't see any reference to the net zero grid by 2035 target. There's a passing reference to net zero by 2050. There is very little here in terms of substance, no reference to the coal phase out, some money, although in the scale of this whole thing, relatively small amounts of money being thrown at renewables in some way and smart grid and storage things. And then another pot of money for major projects, which I don't know what that means and could encompass many, many different things. But otherwise, there's very little here for an overall plan that does put considerable emphasis on electrification, both with respect to buildings and especially strong on electric vehicles. They're talking about 100% EV mandates by 2035 for light duty and 2040 for heavy and medium duty. You would think there would be more here on the electricity side.
Right, I would agree. And there's a line in the plan that talks about construction of new power sources and retrofitting and fuel switching existing power plants and buildings. Now, this, I assume, refers to provinces with a lot of natural gas power generation. That would be Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario. In fact, Ontario is talking about increasing natural gas power generation while its big nuclear plants are offline during the 2020s and early 2030s. Is that a fair take? And if they're fuel switching, what are they going to switch to?
Well, in Ontario, we're not fuel switching to anything, as far as anybody can tell. The plan is very clearly that we are going to be ramping up gas-fired generation 600% relative to 2017 to cover the Pickering retirement, the Bruce and Darlington refurbishments, and also it's become clearer from the ISO as well, any demand growth that's anticipated is going to be met through gas, is the current plan. Alberta's already made its switch from coal to gas. So there are some mutterings about hydrogen as a next stage, but nothing concrete. And Saskatchewan, I'm not sure if they're thinking doing what Alberta did, which is a coal to gas thing. But that only gets you part of the way because you're still burning a lot of fossil fuel to keep the lights on, which if we're supposed to be aiming for net zero by 2035, would seem to be problematic.
Another part of the plan that I found kind of puzzling was the Pan-Canadian Grid Council. Now, there's been a lot of talk. In fact, I've interviewed you about the value and the advantage of having more east-west electricity trade between provinces that have hydro, like BC, Ontario, and Quebec, and then those that don't, like Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario. And the federal government has appeared to think that was they were going to go in that direction with this Pan-Canadian Grid Council. But the section on that doesn't show any federal leadership. It almost seems like you say, this is one of those things where they were backpedaling.
I think so. I mean, whether they've got pushback from provinces would seem to be the obvious answer. I mean, this is a conversation that Ontario definitely doesn't want to have about where it's going with its electricity system. And yet there are lots of potential opportunities. I mean, the most significant one, of course, being the Quebec-Ontario relationship, given that Quebec is having trouble with export infrastructure. There's the Atlantic Loop question as well. So you would think, and you would have thought that there would be more federal money for east-west grid type things, given, particularly Quebec, well, the hydro provinces generally to be able to act as large-scale storage resources. And there seems to be a real backpedal here in terms of, well, we're not doing very many renewables. We're not going to need very much storage. And as I say, the silence on the net zero by 2035 target to me is somewhat deafening. Does this mean we're pulling back from that the pushback from Ontario, particularly it'll be Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Alberta who have pushed back hardest on this. And maybe they've decided Alberta and Saskatchewan, we're going to fight the battle over oil and gas. And maybe we just don't want to pick a fight with Doug Ford going into an election in Ontario.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I mean, you and I have had a number of conversations about this, the Pan-Canadian Grid Council. And I don't think most Canadians understand the enormity of the problem. I mean, economic modelers are saying we're going to need 2 to 3 times as much electricity by 2050. And we don't have a plan to generate that much. And there's, the federal government understands that as well. They've indicated in other statements that they understand that there's, in fact, there's an oblique reference in this plan to needing a lot more electricity to electrify everything. And so the ability to generate, transmit, and distribute that electricity, to not have it play a more prominent role in this plan is just puzzling.
It is. I mean, and even to be beginning to think through what those pathways look like, because we've seen some, lots of modeling sort of pointing those directions. So far, the answers that you've seen have largely been about large hydro and nuclear, both of which are deeply problematic. Large hydro will be very, very difficult to do on new large hydro, and the economics of new nuclear are as horrifying as they always have been. And the UK government's just doing a major bailout on their one new build project this week. So you would think, yes, there'd be some more thought here. Are we doing distributed resources? Are we looking to optimize the resources that we have? Are we looking to develop renewables more aggressively? And yet we're not seeing very much at all. The closest you get is the building energy efficiency stuff, which frees up some resources potentially, but then we're also talking about air source heat pumps, which are going to be very electricity intensive if that's the pathway we're going to take on space heating.
Yeah, it's very interesting because the Americans are proceeding apace. Another thing I don't think many Canadians understand is the extent to which the Americans are modernizing their grid and preparing for a net zero grid. The tens of billions that are going into it and the commitment of the utilities there, they're having the conversation at the utility level, at the government level, policymaker, state level, there in a way that we just aren't. And the difference between the two, between the US and Canada on this issue is just stark to me.
Well, the US for some time has been in a completely different innovative space. I mean, we've seen this from FERC sort of enabling distributed resources. You've seen the usual suspects, the Californias, the New Yorks, the Massachusetts, others sort of moving things forward. Here we seem to be in a touch of sort of, I wouldn't quite say brain death, but something approaching it in terms of the provincial utilities. The only real conversation that seems to be happening of this nature is around the Atlantic Loop idea with Muskrat Falls and Atlantic Canada, and even there, that's still at a fairly preliminary stage. So we seem, we have very deeply entrenched incumbents in the sector who have very close relationships to provincial governments and don't seem particularly interested in moving in these spaces. They remain more interested, those who have capacity, to exporting to the United States than engaging as part of this discussion. How we shift that is unclear. I mean, there were some thoughts that the federal government might lean particularly on the provinces that are burning a lot of gas by, for example, moving the electricity sector out of the output-based pricing system and onto the regular carbon pricing system, which would alter the economics of gas-fired generation fairly profoundly. And again, not a word on that either. So how the how on the buildings and transportation questions then becomes bigger than ever.
Yeah, I think my take on this, Mark, is on the electricity sector. The government has almost taken a step back here at a time when bold leadership is required. And, because the provinces control the electricity systems, essentially, a bold federal leadership was required to begin to get everybody talking about the changes that are required, and that's not reflected in this plan. Well, look, thank you very much for this. Always appreciate your insights.
Good to you. Thanks very much.